good to be with you and to get a chance to talk a little bit with you about my ongoing work looking at cryptocurrency and digital currency and questions of polity, questions of social and political organization, and the religious and theological dimensions thereof. I want to start with a little thought experiment. So here we have everybody's favorite billionaire, Jeff Bezos, who has prompted, of course, many debates about the morality of billionaires, whether we should have billionaires, what they reveal about our society. I invite you to consider how you would feel to have Jeff Bezos as president. And we've had a recent sort of experience with a businessman turned president, so perhaps it's too soon to think about that. How about Jeff Bezos as king? Or perhaps even more markedly, Bezos as the one world emperor. This is perhaps somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but there's an underlying logic to this, and I want to make this a little bit more perhaps realistic. Imagine for yourself that Amazon suddenly announces that in order to transact on its platform, you need to use Amazon currency. Some of you perhaps would say, oh, like, okay, screw you guys, I'm done. And you would have no problem hopping off the platform. I admit I would pause and give it some serious thought, particularly given that I live in rural New Hampshire and do a lot of online ordering. And I've become fairly dependent on the Amazon infrastructure. And let's not forget all the businesses and companies, tens of millions of businesses that rely on Amazon for their supply chain, as well as a platform to sell. So it's highly likely that a number of people would actually be willing to play by Amazon's game, so to speak, in terms of using Amazon's currency to transact. And there's a cascade of implications about what that would mean that we can talk about, and that will come up a little bit in my presentation. But it should be noted that Amazon does have its own currency, the Amazon coin, which we may not have heard too much about because at this point it's really just for certain types of purchases within games and on the Kindle or the Fire. So it's a completely virtual currency that's used for in-app and in-program purchases. But one could imagine that being extended to the entire infrastructure. So today I want to talk a little bit about the differences between cryptocurrency and digital currency, and talk a little bit also about why I've shifted to sort of broaden my scope of study to include digital currencies. As you will remember, I kicked off my research focusing on cryptocurrency primarily. And I want to zoom out and talk a bit about money as a social and political technology to help frame this inquiry. Showcase recent digital currency, and then think about some possible futures. What does this portend? What can we imagine in terms of implications for society, politics, and our life together in light of these developments? I do want to mention some background assumptions here in terms of what's guiding my research. Last time, some of you might remember, I kicked off by talking about the Omega religious movement started by, based on cryptocurrency and blockchain, and the tongue-in-cheek also mention of the Christ coin and the Jesus coin. There are some interesting, fun, headline-catching, overt kinds of religiosity and spirituality around cryptocurrency, but I find myself less interested in that. I'm interested in what I call, and what has been referred to as implicit theologies that are at work in particular the modern West, which is my context. And Alex actually in his introduction talked about the sort of religiosity that many pursue cryptocurrency with, and that's a little bit of what I'm thinking about there too, where it might not be overt sorts of religious or spiritual practice, but the kinds of postures and attitudes that many exhibit in pursuing their interest in cryptocurrency and what it might mean for them. I also don't think that secularity and living in a secular society means at all the absence of religion. There are debates about this, and we can talk at length about this. But we can also see the amplification of religion, the shifting landscapes and territories of what religion means, and the institutional differentiation that secularity inhabits that sometimes amplifies religion. So really what I'm interested in are thinking about the ways that religion, theology, moral and ethical assumptions are in the water, so to speak, under the radar, implicit, and inflect and shape our various social and political institutions. And part of this relates to public theology, which is a term that's in the title of our project that, to my mind, as far as I recall, we actually haven't talked too much about. Perhaps there was a little bit of discussion at the first meeting, which I wasn't present for, but I often wonder what we mean by that and what we all have in mind when this term comes up. And there's at least three meanings that come to mind for me that the public theology often invokes. One is it's speaking from very particular religious traditions into the public sphere, so sort of owning and representing one's religious tradition, but representing it in a public sphere. Public theology can be a more sort of general attempt to build common ground with others, religious or secular, but not on your particular terms. And public theology can also mean this implicit structuring assumptions within institutions and society, something kind of like what Robert Bellah termed civil religion. And that's really a lot of what I'm interested in thinking about these various types of currencies. I'm also very deeply enmeshed in conversations about religion and capitalism, religion and economy. This for me is obvious, although I recognize that for some it might not be, but I take for granted that capitalism and that our economies are structured by religious forces and assumptions. And these are examples of recent books that deal with this connection between religion and capitalism, money, economy, etc. So digital currencies really speak to any sort of, any virtual currency, any kind of electronic currency, which is a broad category. These can be public and they can be private or specialized. And by public, I mean basically state-backed. Fiat currencies that are considered legal tender. So whenever you engage in digital banking, I do all my banking online. I rarely handle cash these days. I'm engaging with digital currency. When you sell money, when you send money via Venmo, PayPal, Zelle, and all these other platforms, you are engaging in digital currency transactions. There are also a variety of private or special monies that can be digital, so rewards or loyalty points, different types of store credit and, again, store loyalty kinds of points, and digital gaming tokens as well. These are examples of digital currencies. Cryptocurrency is a subset of digital currency and a very specific one. I won't go into, I've talked about in the past meetings, unpacking what cryptocurrency is. So just in brief, cryptocurrency is a digital currency, but it's one based on a blockchain-based technology. It's cryptographic. And this technology is what monitors and guarantees transactions. Cryptocurrencies were created initially to circumvent and to try to work around state oversight and state regulation, and to find different sources of trust. So rather than the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and the interest rates that are set, as well as the sort of enforcement, the state's monopoly on violence, if you will, to guarantee legal tender, cryptocurrency seeks to find trust based in the network, in the nodes of various computers and the code that are authenticating these transactions. So I've zoomed out to think more about digital currency, and I want to explain a bit why. So, one might ask, well, there's a lot of crypto frenzy going on. There's so much energy around this. Isn't this where the energy is? Isn't this where the cutting edge is in terms of thinking about digital currencies and the future of economic transactions? So my observation is that a lot of the energy around cryptocurrencies is actually treating it as a commodity, treating it as an investment. Most people are buying cryptocurrency, buying Bitcoin, Ethereum, and on these coins for the investment potential, or trading it as a commodity. They're not actually buying in to use it as a medium of exchange, as an actual monetary token. And there's a difference there, and I think that matters. So why would one then want to or be incentivized these days to use cryptocurrency as an actual medium of exchange? And really, to my take is that it still remains a utopian or a radical sort of vision. You do this because you want to make a statement about circumventing the state, about creating alternative communities, about resisting sovereignty, etc. But there isn't really a coercive mechanism. There really isn't anything forcing you to use cryptocurrency. So there's no mandate. Nobody has declared that this is the form of legal tender that you must use. And there isn't a monopoly in the sense that you don't need to acquire cryptocurrency to access certain goods. There might be a small subset of particular goods that you can only buy with Bitcoin, only buy with Ethereum. But in general, that's not the case. And so there's no incentive, there's no economic coercion that might force you to want to acquire cryptocurrency. On the other hand, digital currencies remain, in general, plugged into the sovereign exchange network. They are backed by the state. They are backed by its laws and its means of legal enforcement, a major one being taxation, that you need to, at some point, if you're doing any sort of business or living in the United States, you need to acquire dollars at some point to pay taxes. It also gives you the broadest access to goods. And so there is a kind of monopoly that this currency has. So in that sense, there's incentive as well as coercion. And there really is a long track record to this kind of currency. Really a 5,000-year track record. We can go back to the ancient Near East and the emergence of debt and monetary instruments that were used in these societies to shape and manage them in particular ways. And this leads me to a key point, a key assumption for me, is that money is a social and political technology. We often think incorrectly that's really about an exchange. Money is just about being able to acquire goods. That's certainly one of its functions, but it masquerades as really only being about that when there's really so much more to what money is and involves. Ultimately, money is a method of governing bodies and directing bodies to do certain things. It's also a profound method of tracking and allocation. It's an accounting mechanism, but it's one that's tied to a centralized power and a centralized standard that declares what their weights and measures and official proportions are for a particular territory, and requires those bodies that are transacting, that are seeking resources, that are producing within that territory to abide by that structure. There's a disciplinary function to money. There's a lot that we could say about the digital difference here. What difference does digitization make, and things for us to discuss. And the previous two presentations have done a great job of kind of thinking about the implications of digitization in different ways. But certainly there's less materiality. I don't want to say that it's immaterial. There are still material networks that matter, and there are still bodies that are transacting behind these screens. But the interactions themselves, the transactions themselves may be disembodied, may feel immaterial. There's a certain kind of space-time compression, to recall David Harvey's famous term, but this notion of the instantaneous ways that digitization carries out transactions, as well as, of course, surveillance and tracking, and ease of spending. It's a lot easier to order online too, and what are the implications of that? So the bottom line is that monetary digitization, it can do a lot to disrupt, to reconfigure, to destabilize our societies and communities in ways that one might think of as progressive and radical and utopian, as well as ways that can become repressive. So I want to talk here briefly about Facebook currency. Facebook tried to pioneer a currency a few years ago called the Libra that was going to be an independent global currency, but it was going to be pegged to a basket of other national currencies. But it was going to be its own sort of independent currency based in blockchain. And there was a massive, massive pushback. As one observer mentioned, it was such a stunning challenge to the international order that the backlash was profoundly powerful. What's the big deal? Who cares? Well, recall that there's 2.8 billion users. It's more than 2 times China's population. So imagine the implications if all of those people began transacting in their own currency. And again, there's a cascade of effects that we can discuss. Regulatory agencies talked about, oh, money laundering and illegal activity. Certainly that's a concern, but the real concern is that this is a profound challenge to state sovereignty. So we talked about Jeff Bezos, but really in some ways, Zuckerberg may be the closest to achieving some sort of one world emperor status if he can oversee a monetary economy, a monetary zone that is larger than the largest, 2 times larger than the largest most populous country in the world. Facebook has since dialed back because of the pushback. It's rebranded as the Diem, which is known as a stable coin now because it's pegged to a national currency. So it maintains parity. It doesn't have its own internal economy, but so if you're in the US, you're gonna use Diems that are paired to the dollar. This doesn't obviate the possibility that exchange rates could be introduced. Just thinking about the economic weight of the big four technology firms. So these four have a market cap of 5 trillion. So the market cap is their total valuation of shares, which ties for third place with Japan after the US and China. So again, just thinking about the economic presence and economic impact of these companies. And this can be broken down by their revenue as well, which are on par with various countries. Facebook, similar to Venezuela, Google and Alphabet, Ukraine, Apple with Vietnam, Amazon with Pakistan. And we might say, okay, these aren't necessarily that imposing of national economies, but again, thinking about the user base and the number of people and bodies that are there transacting with these currencies, there's a profound potential implication there in terms of the economic impact and potential destabilization. I want to pause and ask why would this even be a motive for these various corporations and companies? Why create your own digital currency? So an obvious one is that you can potentially tax these transactions. So every time you buy something on Facebook, perhaps send money on Facebook or pay for a service on Facebook, there can be a small fee that's extracted, which amounts to a kind of corporate tax of your transaction, which could be immensely lucrative. Again, 2.8 billion users, that kind of fee harvesting could be profound. You're creating an economic zone. And so you can contain and bring in and ensure that users are there and that their various activities can generate economic resources for this company. You can also make sure that people are spending more time on these platforms. So, as Sigal mentioned, the kind of the tricks and the hacks for gamification, for the addictive nature of these. Also, if you need to go on these platforms to actually buy the goods that you need, you're going to be on them much more often. Right? And so there's a revenue potential there in terms of harvesting that information and using it to market to you. So one could think of perhaps like a brand loyalty within this umbrella of a corporation as a quasi-nationalism, right? There's an ideology of unity and of using the currency of this particular corporation in the same way that currencies today have the symbols and signs of the country on them. There's a kind of ideology of nationalism that is enforced through the use of currency, again, as it deals with governing bodies within a particular space. If you have control of economic transactions in your space, then you can incentivize certain activities. If you want to direct people to do certain things, you can reward them with discounts and with actual currency, perhaps, as well as penalties. So imagine what being banned from Facebook might mean if you have your accounts frozen, so to speak. You actually have money on Facebook that you use to transact, and now you're banned or your account is in some sort of timeout. So again, the kinds of penalties and negative coercions that could result from this. So ultimately, again, it's about governance. Ultimately, it's about regulating bodies transacting, bodies seeking to satisfy their needs and wants and desires through a transaction mechanism, in this case, money or currency, which has been central to human civilizations for millennia. It's also worth considering, again, under this rubric of public theologies, what are the implicit theologies that might be at work in these attempts to create unified currency zones within corporate spaces, right? What are the sacred canopies, to borrow a term from Peter Berger, that overarch these spaces? And I think of sacred canopies as kind of mapping the ultimate concerns, the symbolic imaginaries that these spaces project to shape hopes, aspirations, and activities. There are all kinds of ethical and moral assumptions as well that are at work here, as well as ethical visions. What are the types of activities that you want to promote and types that you want to discourage based on monetary incentive. There's a lot that one can say about a history of political theology that has shaped our understandings of power and authority, particularly in the West. There's a whole history of God as king, God as emperor, as monarch, that has shaped our assumptions about kings, about the executive branch, and about centralized control. And one could unpack and imagine the kinds of implicit visions of God that are at work in corporate authority structures as well. And of course, these are communities that are shaping bodies and bodily activities and how people connect with one another and promoting particular visions of the world. These are all areas that one might unpack to think about what's at play here under the surface in these bids for these various corporate currencies. So in closing, I'm going to talk about a couple possible scenarios in terms of where this might lead and what this might mean for civilization, so to speak. So we already divide up the country, for instance, into various economic zones. You know, it's not just by state, but there's ways that we can think about different regions of the country that are grouped together by economy. So what might it mean to have a corporate states of America? I was very proud of this map that I created with Google Nation, Amazonia, Appalachia, and Facebookistan, taking the big four here, potentially not too far down the road, carving up the country into their own regions. Realistically, I think we can talk about this in the Q&A, I don't think it would be based on geography. Again, the ways that the notions of presence and connection within technological spaces are different, and so it would be a different kind of allegiance, but this helps us visualize what that might mean. And I think it's very realistic. This is not a just purely sci-fi dystopian vision, but very realistic near future. We also know that we've seen a lot of destabilization and upheaval in the last year, and it's no coincidence that the GameStop, Reddit debacle or excitement coincided with a year of mass protests, of BLM and other forms of organizing. And these are of a piece. They're of the same energies of popular movements, of grassroots organizing, and of a certain kind of reconfiguration and upheaval. And so there are ways that perhaps we can imagine reclaiming and popular grassroots forms of currencies that would push back against these centralized forms of power that corporations are endeavoring to exert. So in closing here, some thoughts. You know, is it, you know, where will the power lie? Will it be with power? Will it be with corporations? Or what might it mean to allocate power to the people? A live question is, what would it look like to create these mass movement currencies? You know, of course, cryptocurrencies were generated with these kinds of utopian dreams. It remains to be seen whether they can actually capture that and enable that for some of the reasons and concerns that I mentioned. And really, is there a way to, you know, again, as we've been saying, corporations have so much power and weight and leverage against us. And so what would it mean to actually push back? And what are the kinds of ethical visions, normative ethical visions that one might be able to harness and capture to promote these kinds of popular, diffuse, democratic forms of currency to resist these forms of corporate consolidation of power? Thanks very much.